Hey everyone, this isn't a gaming or a music video or anything like that. It's a historical lecture. So if that's your thing, please feel free to watch. There is a part one to this video. Somebody watched the entire hour and 50-minute video of me reading the remarks by Max J. Kholer and Dr. Maurice Fishberg on this subject, and then my takeaway at the very end as well. And then they left a like. So thank you. That's very encouraging. I wanted to do the second half of this. This is a very, very, very rare book. So rare, I had to go to a rare books library at the U.S. National Holocaust Museum to even read it. There are news discussions, like newspaper articles from back then, referencing this discussion. It's in the congressional record when it comes to immigration policy. It framed, the civil rights movement going forward all the way up to 1965 through to present day. It was very important because this is the discussion that helped open up the door for Holocaust refugees coming into the U.S. The U.S. had been turning them away. You've got like the St. Louis, which was a boat full of Holocaust refugees that the U.S. turned away. And part of the reason that was happening was because of eugenic stereotypes, and these racial dogmas had already permeated into the American culture through like education and so on and so forth, due to people like Maurice Fishberg and Professor Ellsworth Huntington. So they actually recanted some of their prior ideologies when it comes to genes, to genetics, in this discussion. In fact, Maurice Fishberg ends his career on this night. Like, he has no career after this. He recants everything that he had done, saying, hey, I too was only testing certain population of like the Jewish people to assert a biased anti-Semitic stereotype about Jews. In his case, he was doing it to combat Nazi racism. So the Nazi propaganda of Jews being hook-nosed, dark eyes, curly hair. He did the exact opposite to say, no, actually Jews have aquiline noses. They've got straight hair and so on and so forth. But that's still racism. And Maurice Fishberg basically got lit up by Max J. Kholer and Frans Boas, who were like, you're still racist. You're still being anti-Semitic, right? And so that's why this discussion is super important. And it's not something that's widely known. If you watch the first video at the very end in my takeaway, I talk about the study that I've been doing. And my editor's still in the hospital because he got lynched really, really bad. So pray for him, please. But in our study, we look at how modern genetic stereotypes, or eugenics, modern eugenics as I'd call it, how it influences hate crime. Same thing these guys were doing. Like, it's literally the same discussion, but we're now having to repeat it. And so we look at the same exact thing there. And in there, we find that many of the modern studies being done, modern genetic studies, or I would call it modern eugenics because, again, it's eugenics, are actually circulating around neo-Nazi circles. So there's a slide in there that shows Harry Oster's book, Legacy, A Genetic History of the Jewish People, where in the very first chapter, he actually endorses Maurice Fishberg by saying, hey, look, he was on the right path. He just wasn't very scientific about it, right? But then even Maurice Fishberg in this reading says, no, I was actually on the completely wrong path, and discredited himself. And I know Harry Oster never read this discussion because he never checked this out. And it's that rare of a book that, if you didn't check it out here, you didn't read it. So it's good to preserve this for that reason alone. There's now going to be a reading of this, out on YouTube that apparently there's an audience for. Because I usually quality check my videos and watch the videos from beginning to end, which gives them maybe a little bit of a spike in the YouTube algorithm. I didn't do that with this one. So somebody from YouTube watched this because the lead was generated through YouTube and watched the entire thing. So it's worth putting out, I guess, the historical content too. And it's worth preserving this discussion because it was so very influential. Max J. Kholer, again, he's a civil rights lawyer that in 5681 or 1921 starts the discussion on changing immigration policy. And then by 1924, 5684, the U.S. passes the Immigration Act, ending eugenics and testing of like treating migrants as science experiments because they potentially might become American citizens, right? So you don't want to do something that would be illegal on an American citizen to somebody who might become an American citizen. And then in 1965, that gets updated to reflect because the Civil Rights Act passes, which changes the rights of American citizens. So it updates again in 65. Now, one key thing that never gets updated, though, is education. And that's actually kind of how this rhetoric ends up surviving through until present day, is through education. And this is actually kind of a major point to be making because during the Nazi defense of their actions at the Nuremberg trials, they said, hey, look, the Americans are also doing these eugenic experiments and also have these racial stereotypes and stuff. And the American response to that was, wait a second, we have people like Kholer and Frans Boas, and we're actually changing our legal policies because of this. We don't, as a government, support this kind of ideology. And so we've changed our Immigration Act, and we're now making it illegal to sterilize prisoners and so on and so forth. But in certain areas of the country, that never went away. The state of California still sterilizes people. Governor Newsom has come out and apologized for it, giving reparations to people that were sterilized all the way up until the 5730s or the 1970s. But it's still an ongoing thing. And even in his address, he realized that there still are state-operated facilities that have still ended up sterilizing people. And they've put a lot of money in the state of California towards state-run facilities that run these labs that assert eugenic stereotypes as well. Now, here in New York, it's a different thing. So like Harry Oster works at Einstein University, which honestly, if you work in genetics, they're kind of a laughing stock. It's very embarrassing. But they're owned by Yeshiva University, and Yeshiva University had to step in to take ownership of Einstein University because they kept losing their academic accreditation due to a lot of the inhumane and unscientific stuff that they were doing. So Yeshiva University comes in and bails them out. And then, as I found out, they tested on their own students. So Yeshiva University ran this marriage counseling program, and they took all that data and they numbered their students and told them who they should and shouldn't marry, which is eugenics. And then they provided that genetic data over to Einstein University so that they could use in their studies to try and assert a genetic correlation between being Jewish and, somebody's ancestry. And that is this discussion. And then afterwards in the Nuremberg trials, that ends up actually becoming the definition of Nazism, is correlating a genetic marker with the Jewish people is considered Nazism. And the reason for that being, again, is when the Nazis said, hey, the U.S. is doing this too. The U.S. said, wait, we're not endorsing it on the government level, and we're trying to get rid of that. They'd already stepped away from that. When the Japanese, who were part of the axis of evil when it came to them, they were doing inhumane experiments, but they were doing it on everybody, including like Japanese people themselves and stuff, and they weren't correlating it genetically like the Nazis were, not to the same scale. And then the Italians were also fascists, right? They had these super restrictive, oppressive government policies, but they weren't doing the whole eugenics part, right? So the thing that the Nazis specifically were doing was the eugenics stuff, and they were inserting it into their education. So in order to get it out of education, they had to define it this way. And that's why throughout the Nuremberg trials and then during the Potsdam Conference, where they discuss how to make sure that Nazism doesn't come back, it's always defined separately. The concentration camps are one thing, the fascist policies of the government are another, the German militarism is another, but the Nazism, the propaganda of the Nazi Party, Hitlerism, or the ideology is always defined as these genetic assumptions made about race. And so, that's where we're at. And again, we see this happening in our modern day society. There's a resurgence of it. So that's what prompted me to read this and go there. And I guess without further ado, I will just try to read through it. It's just going to be a straight reading, so and then at the very end I'll give a slide with my thoughts and stuff. So this is a reading of Aryan and Semite with particular reference to Nazi racial dogmas, address delivered before the Judeans and Jewish Academy of Arts and Sciences, March 4th, 1934 in New York City, by Professor Boas, Frans Boas, Dr. Maurice Fishberg, Professor Ellsworth Huntington, and Max J. Kholer. In today's reading, it will be part 2, and we'll be reading the sections by Professor Ellsworth Huntington, Professor Frans Boas, and then finally a bit of legislation by Max J. Kholer. The Cause of Jewish Greatness by Ellsworth Huntington. When your president asked me to speak at this meeting, he kindly sent me a copy of the latest volume of The Judeans. Being a scientist, I was naturally attracted by the articles bearing on the problem of degree of eminence by the Jews. An article by Professor Maurice R. Cohen modestly advances a reasonable claim to a high place for Jews as contributors to modern science. He decries the use of statistics, however, to prove this. In another article, Professor Benjamin Harrow apologizes for using statistics, but nevertheless employs them. He says that 9 Nobel Prize winners in chemistry, physics, and medicine out of a total of 79 up to 1928 have been Jews. This shows that in comparison with the people of Europe and America as a whole, the Jews are about 5 times as likely to achieve the sort of distinction implied by such prizes. I disagree with both these gentlemen, not as to the achievement of the Jews, but as to the use of the statistical method. If a problem is statistical, I know of no other way to solve it except by statistics. Perhaps someone has made a careful statistical study of eminent Jews, but I have not seen it. Professor Adolf Bartels, however, who is not only the author of a well-known history of German literature, but an ardent anti-Semite, has made some strong statements along this line. He was quoted here by Mr. Kholer in 1927 as saying that 1 out of every 6 German authors since 1870 has been a Jew, although there is only 1 Jew for every 100 inhabitants. He also said that Jews are dominant in drama and other forms of literature. I once tried to compare the American Jews with various Christian denominations by means of Who's Who in America. Among the 19 religious groups thus considered, the Jews stand 7th, with 20 eminent persons per 100 ardents of all ages. They are surpassed by the Unitarians of 1,185, Universalists by 390, Episcopalians by 156, Congregationalists by 115, Presbyterians by 62, and so-called Christians by 45. This, however, is very unfair to the Jews for 2 reasons. First, a large percentage of Jews have come to this country so recently that they have not yet had time to become thoroughly Americanized and thus attain their true place as contributors to the country's activities. Second, a large part of the Jews in Who's Who fail to indicate their religious adherence, and one can only judge it by inference. All 3 of the eminent gentlemen who share this platform with me tonight were omitted from the preceding tabulation for this reason. By reading a full account of Dr. Fishberg's and Mr. Kholer's Who's Who, one sees that they must be Jews. But in the case of Dr. Boas, this is not evident. Of course, many Christians also fail to indicate any religious affiliation, but perhaps not so commonly as do the Jews. If allowance were made for the recency of the Jewish bulk of migration to this country and for the failure to indicate their religious affiliation in Who's Who, I believe that the Jews, as leaders in present-day America, would stand at least as high as the Presbyterians and perhaps with Congregationalists and Episcopalians. They would still by far surpass the Unitarians and Universalists, but those 2 small and highly selective groups illustrate the very point which I propose to elaborate in respect to the Jews. When we turn to the past, the outstanding quality of the Jews as leaders is ever more clear than at present. Aside from a small groups like the Athenians, Icelanders, Farsis, and a few others, it is probably that no other set of people has so furnished so many distinguished leaders in proportion to its numbers. Whether the Jews have surpassed other groups to any one definite time is, of course, a matter of opinion, but there is one phrase of all matter where there is little or no room for questions. Among all the world's groups of people, there is one which, for so long a time, so uninterruptedly, and to so high a degree in the proportion of its numbers, has furnished great leaders. The line of Jewish greatness stretches unbroken from the days of Moses and even Abraham through Isaac, Jesus, and a host of others, down to Hennane, Mendelssohn, and Einstein. The Chinese may have produced a continuous and long line of great leaders, but the number of people whom they have drawn has been enormously greater than among the Jews. Greece, in its prime, probably rose higher than the Jews had ever risen at any point. One epoch, Jesus, Paul, Peter, John, and their companions provide a galaxy of comparable to Socrates, Plato, Pericles, and Phidias, in an influence, although not in variety of talents. Today, in proportion to their numbers, the Scandinavians, the Puritan stock in America, the upper classes of England, and certain other groups rival or surpass the Jews, but no other group in proportion to its size shows a line of great men so long, so unbroken, and of such consistently high quality. The reason for this consistent and prolonged ability are of the utmost interest not only to the Jews, but to everyone who would understand history or improve the world of the future. A comparison of the Jews with any or all of their other outstanding groups which have just been mentioned suggests that one common factor upon which the greatness of all depends is rigid selection followed by more or less complete segregation. A few examples from different stages of Jewish history will make the matter clear. The most outstanding contribution of the Jews to human progress had been along the line of religion in the old days, and philosophy and philanthropy today, as appears from such things as the Guggenheim and Rosenwald foundations, and the $5 million per year spent on Jewish charities in New York City. The Bible, including both Old and New Testament, sums up the main religious contributions. It was the work of people descended mainly, if not wholly, from a small band of Jews who returned from Babylonia after captivity about 500 years before Christ. Our problem is to discover why this little group, never numbering more than a few 100,000, not only achieved such signaling success, but contributed so fully upon religion. Concentrated so fully upon religion. The answer in both cases is that these people were the results of a long process of selection and segregation in which religion was the main factor. Thus, not only sociologically, but biologically, the people who were of religious temperament became dominant. The Jews who wrote the Bible were a result of a long process of evolution. 1,000 years before Christ, King David had made Jerusalem the religious center of the Israelites. About 900 BC, the realm of David broke into two kingdoms after death of Solomon. The southern section included only a tiny rock plateau of Judea with an area of up to 800 to 1,000 square miles, much of which was too rugged to be cultivated. The other kingdom, Israel, was much larger, less rugged, more accessible, and far more desirable according to ordinary standard. Nevertheless, the hold of Jerusalem on the more thoughtful Jews was so great that, according to the chronicler, many priests and Levites and after them, out of all the tribes of Israel, such as set in their hearts to seek Jehovah, the God of Israel, came to Jerusalem to sacrifice unto Jehovah, the God of their fathers, so that the strength of the kingdom of Judea. so they'd strengthen the kingdom of Judea. Even though the chronicler is endeavoring to magnify the religious importance of Jerusalem, there can be little doubt that when Jehoram, the king of Israel, made life unpleasant for the priests and the Levites and for those who refused to worship the two golden calves, there was a migration of a more religious type of people away from Israel into Judea. This is the kind of thing that intensely religious people often do. They're stern, determined, set, and insist on doing what they believe is right, even at the expense of personal sacrifice. The migration of every 100,000 of such men with their families would have been enough to give a very strong religious cast to the kingdom of Judah. Remember, a small size of the country, its ruggedness, and thin soil. Remember the small size of the country, the ruggedness and thin soil. It looms large in history, but it was smaller than Rhode Island and no more fertile. Today, the village and farm population of Rhode Island amounts to only about 50,000, and it is doubtful whether that Judea, including Jerusalem, amounted to much more, especially in the troublesome days after the divisions of the kingdom. Judah and Jerusalem play so great a part in history that it's very difficult to realize how few people they really supported in their old primitive days when the character of the people who produced the Bible was being formed. Remember, too, that its rugged, inhospitable nature caused Judea to be very isolated, almost like our Kentucky mountains, so that the people once established there changed very slowly, either biologically or socially. After the relatively religious character of Judah had been thus established, there was probably for some time a slight infiltration of more religious people from the kingdom of Israel. Moreover, for a far longer time, there was doubtless an outward movement of Judeans of the more worldly type who prefer the greater ease of life in the surroundings areas rather than the austere, limited regime of their plateau. The whole history of the next 300 years after the divisions of the kingdoms reflects the attempt of the plateau to preserve its old religion. While the northern kingdom gradually fell away, the main point of our argument, however, is that the great crisis when the two kingdoms were separated and selective migration apparently gave Judah an unusually large portion of people who were religious and temperate. This means, I believe, that not only an entrenchment of religion as a social agency governing the life of the Jewish people, but an actual biological selection so that the Judeans ultimately included an unusually large percentage of people who were inherently of such temperament that religion and highly moral code appealed to them. And these people, to be noted, were isolated physically by their rugged plateau, politically by the rivalry of the two kingdoms, and socially by their religion. Therefore, both the social and biological tendencies had full opportunity not only to persist, but to become intensified. At a later time, in a similar but much more drastic selection and isolation of the finest religious types took place when the Assyrians conquered Jerusalem in 586. Not only was Jerusalem sacked, but the cream of its population was carried away to Babylon. As the Book of Kings puts it, Nebuchadnezzar carried away all of Jerusalem and all princes and all the mighty men of valor, even 10,000 captives, and all craftsmen, save the poorest sort of the people of the land. And similar events happened a third time, for the poor people who were left behind. Rebelled against the Assyrian king, finally condition became so bad that practically all who were left in Judea, including even the prophet Jeremiah, moved away to Egypt. Meanwhile, the Jews were carried off to Babylonia. Meanwhile, the Jews who were carried off to Babylonia faced two alternatives. They could either give up their old faith and become like the people in their new land, or they could hold on to the old faith in spite of the ridicule and all sorts of social handicaps. How many followed each course, no one knows, but a knowledge of human nature and of what has happened elsewhere under such circumstances makes it certain that once again the more religious type of Jews persisted in worship of Jehovah, while less religious types fell away. Now comes the most dramatic episode of the whole process by which the Jews become the world's supreme contributors to the progress of religion. When Cyrus and the Persians conquered the Assyrians, he issued a decree in 538 BC permitting any Jews who so desired to go back across and around the desert to Jerusalem. 700 long weary miles these people had to travel, largely on foot, no doubt, but helped by camels and donkeys. Nevertheless, to quote the book of Ezra, then rose up the heads of fathers, houses of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites, even all whose spirit God had stirred to go up to build the house of Jehovah, which is in Jerusalem. And all they that were round about them strengthened their hands with vessels of silver, with gold, with goods, and with beasts, and with precious things, besides all that was willingly offered. The Bible says 40,000 people thus migrated back to Judah. But this is certainly a great exaggeration. But even if only 2,000 or 3,000 came in the course of a score of years, their presence amongst the population was so small that that which presumably still remained in Judah would go far towards determining the character of the people. The significant fact concerning them is that they represent still another vigorous selection. Remember that the cream of Judah was carried by Babylon. Remember that the Judeans, as a whole, through their long process of natural selection and training, had become very religiously minded people. Remember, too, that during the 70 years of captivity, there must have been some apostasy among the exiles who were not of strong-minded religious temperament. Now, from this intensely religious remnant, there was a selected and relatively small number whose spirit God had stirred up to the building of house of Jehovah, which is in Jerusalem. Such selective migration occurred not once, but several times, as appears from the story of Nehemiah. As justly famous man who returned to Jerusalem probably in 375 BC. His story, unfortunately, is preserved in his own words as universally regarded as authentic. It shows that the Jews who returned a century or a century and a half earlier had not met with much success in restoring Jerusalem, but it also shows that the religion was still the dominant factor in the biological as well as social evolution of the Jews. Thus, Jerusalem, together with little neighboring area, which was all the Jews possessed Judea, was once more reinforced by very highly selected people. This does not mean that the richest, most influential, or most able among the Jews went back to their homes, but in most cases, such people had established themselves and preferred to stay where they were. Only those whom religious and racial fervor burned very strongly found sufficient incentive to make the long journey back across the desert, where they were in fear of their lives from desert raiders. Nor was there much to attract them at the end of their journey. Therefore, as Nehemiah vividly relates, the neighboring people of the land raised all sorts of difficulties, trying to prevent the rebuilding of Jerusalem and trying to make the Persian kings believe that the return of the Jews was plotting a revolt. The returned Jews were plotting a revolt. Remember, too, that more than 2 centuries had probably elapsed since the ancestors of the migrants had been carried away to Babylonia. If England were in a state of poverty like that of Judea 400 years ago before Christ, how many Americans whose ancestors came from this country before 1750 would think of going back under any circumstances? Only those in whom the fire of religious zeal and love of race and of tradition burned with extraordinary fervor, or whose love of adventure appealed most strongly, would find much incentive to go back to the old home. This selection was perhaps the most drastic of all through which the Jews passed in their long history. They had been stifled and stifled until only a grain of particular size was left. That size represented a treatment with which extraordinary religious and extraordinarily imbued with the feeling of missions of its race. Even a few 100,000 people would be a prominent opponent factor in reviving the old spirit and the old inheritance among the people descending in a large part from earlier returning exiles. Now, for the last step in the great eugenic problem of the Jews, according to both Ezra and Nehemiah, as soon as Jerusalem had been rebuilt, they're cropping out an old trouble. The daughters of the land were fair, and the Jews were in a small minority. In the midst of the people who were akin to them like blood and language, but remote in religious ideals. Among the exiles who had come back from Babylon, the men doubtlessly much outnumbered the women. Naturally, then, the men took themselves wives of the people of the land, thus temporarily exaggerating the tendency which always arose, the king antagonism of ultra-Jewish party. Such men as Ezra and Nehemiah, intensely Jewish and intensely religious, raised a storm of protest against the foreign marriages and had their way. So drastically was the policy that for every foreign wife together with their children was expelled. If the men would not put away their wives, they too must leave. Thus, during the years of trial, they became entrenched in Jewish social system, one of strictest rules that has ever permeated intermarriage with other races. This policy continued so long as the Jews remain in Judea. It is as strong as ever. Those, like the parents of Jesus, who had recently moved a few score from Judea to Galilee. Thus, the entire period with which both the Old and New Testaments were taken from form was dominated by a type of social and religious segregation, which was greatly fostered by physical segregation arising from the ruggedness of Judea. Under such conditions, the original biological as well as social characteristics of the racial groups tend to not only preserved but strengthened. People do not like such systems tend to migrate to regions that are socially more free. Such a tendency is especially strong when a poor region like Judea is surrounded by regions that are much more attractive and prosperous. Here, then, is the upshot of the whole matter. We see in the Jews an unparalleled example of natural selection, though migration which went from more or less continuous aim to produce segregation of religious temperament. Thus, there was produced a racial stock which is rigorously called peculiar, rightly called peculiar, for it is peculiar not in the sense of being unique, but in greatly honored because of its long line of eminent sons. The race, as might be expected, gave rise to by far the most extraordinarily set of religious leaders that the world has ever seen, from Jeremiah to Isaiah and the real psalmists who lived long after David, down through the other prophets and the authors of the patriarch, and through other books to Jesus and his disciples. The line of succession passes unbroken. Judaism, Christianity, Mohammedanism all owe their highest and finest qualities to these great leaders. It would be very hard to find any other racial group that has exerted so profound an influence upon the lives of billions of human beings. All this, it seems, could scarcely have happened without a combination of action, first, of physical environment in the form of inhospitable plateau, second, of biological inheritance providing people of high caliber and of religious temperament, and third, of social organization providing a framework which supported, preserved, and developed a system in harmony with the demands of the geographic environment and the biological inheritance. It is because we failed to give all three of these factors their fair share of credit that so much of our thinking is muddied. The process which produced the great Jews of the past has by no means come to an end, even though it has changed its form. The Jews today, as it is well known, are a highly mixed race. The Spanish of the Sephardim type are long-headed with black hair and finely chiseled features. There are Semites, much resembling the Arabs, and not greatly differing from the Mediterranean people among whom they lived. The Ashkenazim are broad-headed people with coarse features. Their hair is generally black, but often ruddy or sandy. According to the usual anthropological definitions, the two types are racially far apart. In spite of these great physical diversity, the Jews as a whole appear to be at least homogeneous in characteristics, as is any other national group such as the Italians, and it seems to most people that they are much more so. The Sephardim, to be sure, are generally said to be more cultured than the Ashkenazim, and to have contributed to a larger portion of great men. Nevertheless, both branches display the same adaptation to business and to the city life, and the same characteristics of devotion to race and religion. In other words, although the Jews were highly diverse physically and lived in many environments, they seem to be relatively homogeneous mentally. The physical diversity of the Jews is explained largely by slavery, intermarriage with Gentiles, and proselytism. Until far along in the Christian era, slavery was almost universal. The Jews of the dispersion, being relatively prosperous, owned many slaves, and it was common practice to circumcise the men and thereafter regarded their children as Jews. Thus, the more Jewish community prospered and the better it treated its slaves, the more rapidly it ceased to be truly Jewish in race. Intermarriages between Jews and Gentiles have been much more common than usually supposed. This has been especially the case where the Jewish community has been a small and where it has been on good terms with the people of other religions. It has been commonly supposed among Gentiles, at least, that when a Jew marries a Christian, the Jew is likely to leave the Christian community, so as the children are to be brought up as Gentiles. This, however, is by no means the case for frequently the Gentile parent in such cases has adopted the Jewish religion. In other cases, the strong faith of the Jewish mother sweeps the children into her own faith, regardless of the father. This brings up the important question of proselytism. Judaism is not a missionary religion in the same sense as Christianity. It has made a vast number of converts, strangely enough, or rather naturally enough, through the flow of converts to Judaism has often been stimulated through persecution. A similar situation is well known in respect to early Christianity. And why should it not also be true for Judaism? The high moral code, the principles of duty to God and man, and the care which one member of the community takes of another are pronounced and noble in Judaism, as in Christianity, which borrowed them from Judaism. A person whose temperament leads him to become a Christian in the face of persecution might equally well become a Jew under appropriate circumstances. Moreover, there have been some cases of wholesale conversion to Judaism amongst the Khazars, who gave rise to the broad-headed Russian type of Jew, the Ashkenazim. In the view of high diversity of racial origin through slavery, Gentile marriages, and proselytes, the comparatively homogeneous mental character of Jews demands careful explanation. The secret of the matter seems to be that the constant flux of gain and loss among the Jews, there has been a steady tendency towards the concentration of certain mental traits among those who have remained in the Jewish community. This appears to be one of the main reasons for the continued greatness of the race. From beginning to end, the process of gain and loss in the Jewish community have gone on side by side. In peaceful times, when there is no special persecution, the Jews tend to intermarry with Christians, especially in the upper classes. With this goes a tendency for Jews of higher type to renounce their old faith and adopt Christianity, as happens to be the case by Heim, Born, Gaines, Neander, and Felix Mendelssohn. If such conditions should continue long enough, and if the Gentiles were wise enough to make absolutely no distinction between Jew and Gentile, the Jews would probably in due time become no more separate from the rest of the people than are Catholics and Protestants. Many of their leaders would probably become Unitarians, but persecution has continually broken out, and even in countries like the United States and Great Britain, there are waves of anti-Semitism. Such conditions have the opposite effect from those of harmonious cooperation. They tend to remove weak elements from the Jews, but draw to them many strong elements. Under stress of persecution, the morally weaker types come and forswear their old religion. The weakling denies his faith, apts to the customs of his persecutors, and in many cases ultimately loses his old affiliations. The strong man is influenced in the exact opposite way. If he has been lukewarm, he stiffens up and defends his race and his religion. If he is of mixed blood, partly Jew and partly Gentile, and the spirit of chivalry beats high in his heart. In quiet, comfortable times, he and his children might have been lost to the Jewish community, but now he proudly asserts his Jewish connections and springs to the defense of his Jewish relatives. Only the strong and brave do this. However, the weak flee to the safety of some other fold. And this, I believe, this holding of strong while the weak are slaw off, is one of the main reasons why the Jews still stand high in achievement and have stood so ever since the dispersion of Palestine, as well as before that time. The process of selection of partial segregation is not peculiar to the Jews. The Roman Catholic Church is continually losing some of its members and gaining others. Those who are generally of inquiring, independent type of mind, they cannot accept certain doctrines which do not agree with their personal methods of reasoning, and they are not willing to accept the limitations of their thinking. Those who join the Roman Catholic Church are likely to be of an emotional, submissive type, persons who love beautiful forms and ceremonies and who desire to escape from the torment of a single act of great faith. The Salvation Army represents another type of selection. It, too, is a refuge for people who do not wish to reason everything out for themselves and who likewise stake everything on a great act of faith. But with them, there is always another urge in the form of an intense desire to be of service and see immediate results for their service. Contrast either of these with the Unitarians. Temperamental, the Unitarians are at the opposite pole. To the Salvation Army recruit the main element in their religion and their life is the emotions. To the Unitarian, it is the intellect. The Salvation Army listens with delight to the extortions and implications of popular evangelicalists, and thoughtful Unitarians find the same evangelicalists repulsive or else in an interesting psychological study. If the person with the Salvation Army temperament happens to be born a Unitarian, which does not often occur, the chances that while still young, he will leave the cold Unitarian fold. If he is too intellectual to join the army, he may become an Episcopalian or join some other culture denomination that displays warmth and fervor. If the child with thoughtful, unemotional, and strongly analytical temperament happens to be born of Salvation Army parents or in the Roman Catholic fold, he is far more likely than his emotional brother to become a Presbyterian or Congregationalist. This selective process has made much to do with the fact of who's who. The representation of Unitarians in proportion to their numbers is 170 times as great as that of Roman Catholics, at 75 times as great as that of Baptists. Among Jews, the selection has tended towards intellectual rather than the emotional side, and this has helped keep high their general level of achievement. The Puritans of New England present a close parallel to the Jews in many respects. Today it is their custom to sneer at the old Puritans as hard-visages, narrow-minded, bigoted, and hypercritical killjoys. Nevertheless, it is an undeniable fact that the descendants of these same Puritans have supplied and are still supplying American leaders in far greater proportion than is any other member group of our people. The Puritans came to New England only 18,000 strong, whereas immigrants of other types numbered hundreds of thousands in colonial days and millions after 1830. Nevertheless, the descendants of the Puritans fill an enormous number of the most important positions, especially in intellectual life of the nation. In the study of some typical families of this kind, I have found that they are five times as likely as to produce men of science as are the average people of the English descent in the country as a whole. They are 6 times as likely to be mentioned in Who's Who, 8 times as likely as to be authors, 17 times as likely to be included in the Encyclopedia Britannica. While the Puritan stock, just as we have with Jews, the secret of success appears to lie in the drastic selection long ago, and in at least partial social segregation by means of strong but now decreasing tendency to marry only of their own kind. The selection took place under the stress of persecution in England. In other words, it has religious just as among the Jews. There was also, however, a drastic selection in the basis of temperamental and physical constitution. Only the mentally alert, adept, and optimistic, and physically strong could stand the hardships and discouragement of those early migrants. Then, until 1830, the descendants of the selected early migrants could marry only their own kinds, for practically no other immigrants came from New England. Like Judah, that region was poor and unattractive, but for the very reason it preserved the Puritan type biologically and permitted the Puritan social system to grow unhampered. Time fails to tell how the same principle of selection and social or physical segregation helps explain the greatness of such people such as the Athenians, the British aristocracy, the Quakers, as well as the little-known but extremely competent groups like those of the Parsis in India and the Maori natives in New Zealand, and the Icelanders, who, in proportion to their own numbers, has surpassed all other recent nations in supplying persons of sufficiently distinguished to be included in the encyclopedia. In every case, the biological selection of unusually competent type has gone hand in hand with the evolution of strong social systems, with the production of any unusual member of person's outstanding ability. The Jews by no means stand alone. They represent a type. All this has a deep lesson for the future. It suggests, in first place, that anti-Semitism defeats its own ends. Not only does it rally neutral outsiders to the defense of a race which is unjustly persecuted, but it removes weaklings from among the Jews and brings back to them strong people who might otherwise drop away. Secondly, the reasoning here set forth suggests that the way to make a great nation is to make the strongest possible bid for people of high grade whenever they are founded. I have sometimes idly speculated upon what would happen if the United States were to take $100 million per year from its military expenditures and devote them to bringing this country's foreign leaders of all kinds who would come with their families and settle permanently. We could bleed Europe white in this way and strengthen ourselves almost inconceivably. Even if we cannot and should not adopt such a plan, we can at least adopt the policy of picking our immigrants on the basis of their achievements and heredity. With a rational, honest administered system of the sort, we could admit only persons who would be well above average quality of our own and in morally intellectually strength. Then we could admit people of all sorts, regardless of race, nationality, or religion, provided only those rose sufficiently high in the finer elements of character of national achievement. Of course, it's utopia to hope for such a system. Nevertheless, every great group of people contains many who are of a high type biologically, so that they they not only respond quickly to the training and opportunity, but pass on these traits to their descendants. As yet to be sure, we are only beginning to explore the secrets of human heredity, but human experience in the case of the various groups here mentioned indicate that even with their present knowledge, great progress can be made if only we select our high-grade people and encourage them by the parents of the future generations. It is not incumbent upon the United States, nor is it desirable to accept migrants or immigrants simply because they are oppressed and persecuted, but religious and political oppression, often, nay, usually directed against people whose quality is far above averages, should, for such individuals, the United States should still be a refuge. Remarks of Professor Frans Boas, Professor of Anthropology, Columbia University. I hardly know what to say after the kindly reception you have accorded me. I should like to express myself at least in one respect. We see clearly the ways in which anti-Semitism has developed in Germany, how it has been fostered and nourished by laying at the doors of the Jews all causes of misery and the resulting evils under which Germany is still suffering. I believe we must interpret this as a case of hysteria, similar to the hysteria of the Middle Ages, which took hold of a large mass of people. There is little use in trying to fight such hysteria while it is at its height. It is a fire that must burn itself out. There is another aspect that deserves serious consideration. I'm not quite as sanguine as our chairman, who suggests that such an outbreak is absolutely impossible to America, that anti-Semitic agitation could get no foothold in our country. I see publications such as The Libertation of the Silver Shirts, The Awakener, and others which are stimulating and fomenting racial hatred. I do believe it behooves us not to treat this matter in the same way as what was done in Germany. It may seem unlikely that these ideals should hold sway in the United States, but we should not forget that the movement is vigorous and unscrupulous. What can be done under these circumstances? One thing is to show our hollowness of the arguments of those who would claim superiority of any particular race. It is easy to show weakness of these arguments, but if we are asked to show, on the contrary, that the behavior of a race does not depend on its descendant, but upon the historical conditioning of cultural stages, we are in a weak position because it is hard to give conclusive proof to our claim. I believe there are two thoughts that will occur to everyone who considers this question. First of all, as Dr. Fishberg suggests, the Jews are not uniform in descent. There is no race in which a whole world is consisted of families of uniform character. Every race embraces many diverse family lines. It is incorrect to assume that all members of racial groups possess uniform characteristics because they are similar in some respects. All people who are blonde and have blue eyes have not the same characteristics, and there is no reason to give inordinate weight to this single feature. Blondness has nothing else but an effective domestication, which we find in all mammals like horses, rabbits, and pigs. We never claim that blonde domesticated animal is superior in pigment to a pigmented domesticated animal. There is a reason to think that the Eastern European, a racial type of blonde, exists entirely different from the Northwestern European. The distribution types of the blonde also shows a lack of uniformity in the so-called Nordic race. The whole concept of race lacks in clarity, and in general error, and a great error is committed by assuming that people who look alike in some respects must be alike in all respects. One of the tasks before us is to show that the prevailing idea of race is erroneous, that we are dealing with certain hereditary lines, each of which has its own characteristics. A second and most important question is how far, when speaking of racial characteristics, such characteristics are determined to be hereditary, and how far they are due to other causes. How does a certain individual behave under different types of geographical social environment? This question is difficult to answer. Quite a good deal can be accomplished by research, and much has been accomplished It is often by claiming that the Negroes are less intelligent than whites, a conclusion is based on the result of intelligence tests. When we classify Negroes in cities according to the time elapsed since their arrival, we find that those who have been longer in cities are much more intelligent than those who have lived in cities for only a short time. Year after year, they grow in intelligence, and in course of time, they approach the city people. Investigations into the relative speed of response of various races, whites, Indians, Negroes, have been made in the city and in rural environment. It has been found that the city people are speedily and inaccurate. Country people are slow and accurate. In short, good many indications show a difference, and differences are determined more by environment than racial descent. The real question at issue is how far is human behavior determined by heredity, and how far by cultural environment. We ought to see to it that our whole people become familiar with the data bearing upon its subject that we have assembled that there are available at the present time. When we observe the energetic propaganda of racial enthusiasts, we ought to see to it that careful selection material, popular in form and correct in content, should be placed in the hands of many people as possible. Everything in our power should be done to achieve this end, so that the vicious propaganda which exists at this time should not take root. So I was going to leave this part out, but I think it's important for the historical aspect, and because a lot of these legal arguments are actually really good. So this is what Max J. Kholer was trying to do, right? The appendix. A proposed new penal enactment against racial and religious propaganda by Max J. Kholer. At the very time these addresses were delivered, a report by Mr. Kholer on the bill in the New York legislature to curb Nazi racial propaganda in the Empire State, prepared on the behalf of the Committee of Legislation of the New York County of Lawyers Association, was in the mails en route to Albany. As it deals with some little-known legal aspects of such racial propaganda, it is reprinted here. It deals with Assembly Bill number 685, introduced to the Assemblyman Breitbart of Brooklyn, to amend the New York Civil Rights Law by inserting a new Section 40B entitled Dissemination of Propaganda Injurious to Members of Any Race or Religious Belief. The report approves the bill in principle. It deals exclusively with the legal aspects and precedents involved as followed. This bill seeks to make it illegal and subject to penalties of not less than 100 or more than 500 of irrevocable by action, and misdemeanors subject to such fine or imprisonment for no less than 30 days, no more than 90 days, or both. To disseminate any propaganda, caricatures, statements, etc., whether written or printed or oral, which subjects or exposes or calculated, intended, or likely to subject or expose any race, creed, or color to hatred, contempt, ridicule, obligatory, or which causes or tends to cause any race, creed, color, or person belonging to purported to be of any race, creed, color to be shunned or avoided. For many years, it has been adjudged in Anglo-Saxon countries that even willful false liable directives against race or religious community cannot be made the subject of civil libel or slanderous proceedings, however vicious, inflammatory, or injurious they may be, and the right to maintain criminal proceedings for libel in such cases is ineffective and commonly ill-advised because of the difficulty of proving a universal negative, and doing so beyond a reasonable doubt. By reason of this fact, as early as 1732, England allowed prosecution in such cases apparent for the action of inciting to the breach of peace, which was the case explained and approved in the early days of New York, case of Reichman versus Devlin, 25 Windle 184 at 195-6. Curiously enough, the case of Rex versus Osborne, Serpra, involved an outrageous libel against the Jews of England, and the court held that the crime was thereby committed, which could be prosecuted either according to one of the versions of the criminal libel and other versions of the incitement to breach of peace, in the opinion the court said. Such sort of advertisement necessarily tending to rise to the tumults and disorders and inflame them with the universal spirit of barbarity against the whole body of men, as if guilty of crimes such sacred, practicable, and totally incredible. This case was cited with approval and followed in the State versus Brady 44 Kansas 435 and Peo versus Spellman 318 Illinois 842, which held that the criminal libel proceedings would lie for the libeling the American Legion, as also Palmer versus Kholer 48 New Hampshire 211, and holding that the libel against the U.S. Army in Virginia could be prosecuted criminally, and that the criminal libel proceedings were held to lie on the account of the libels against the Knights of Columbus collectively and the Catholic priests collectively in Crane versus State 14 Oklahoma Criminal 30, Jones versus State 838, Texas Criminal 364, Peo versus Gordon 219, Pacific California 486, and Peo versus Eastman 188, New York 478 at 481. See also Weston versus Commercial Arbitrator Associates 184, New York 479, and Borman versus Star Co. 174, New York 212. See also the prosecution of the Klu Klux Klaner for breach of peace, reported as West versus Commonwealth 208, Kentucky 735. In various European countries, such proceedings based upon libel against the whole religious denominations are maintainable. It is probable that such publications constitute criminal embraced in the classification of breach of peace. Incitement to are now criminally actionable, criminally actionable, but that is not absolutely clear. New York Penal Code Section 43, making it an offense to commit any act willfully, wrongly, which seriously disturbs or endangers public peace, which no other punishment is excessively prescribed, covers the some phrases of such misconstruct as construed by the People versus Moise 171 New York 423 and the People versus Neeson 179 Appellant Division 869, and also New York Penal Law Section 2092, under which earlier most prosecution took place. Compare U.S. Code Title 18, Section 335, making it a criminal to mail wrappers or envelopes or postals containing writing calculated and intended to reflect injurious upon the character or misconduct of another. These statutes proceed, however, on theory of the tendency to cause breaches of the peace, which may not always be satisfactory, provable, and our New York civil rights law resorts to the 1925 Section 53-6 to check the machinations of the Klu Klux Klan by requiring filing with the Secretary of State under criminal penalties of sworn copies of the list of officers and members in Constitution, bylaws, rules, and oaths of membership, such as organizations appropriate with exemptions. Although the statute did not disclose on its face the purpose of the check and the activities of the Klu Klux Klan and the fomenting antagonism and prejudice against Catholic Jews and Negroes, the United States Supreme Court, in sustaining the statute in Bryant versus Zimmerman, 278 U.S. 63 at 76, in the case involving the organization, emphasized the harmful character of organizations thus simulating harmful religious and race prejudices, and sustained the constitutionality of the law. Compare Judge Collins' reference to the anti-Irish Catholic agitation in the early days of Brink versus Stratton, 176 New York 150 at 161. Prohibitions against stirring up racial or religious antagonism without exaction of proof of tendency to incite breaches of the peace are therefore quite in the order of the civil rights laws, especially in the view of general purpose of authoritatively expounded upon many years ago in the leading case of People versus King, 1110 New York 418. Moreover, cases construing and sustaining the validity of statutes, ordinances, or regulations against dangerous social or industrial propaganda were conveniently collated in the note in 1ALR 336, including State versus Quainley, 86 New Jersey Law 120, State versus Board 86 New Jersey Law 75, effective 87 New Jersey Law 228, State versus Fox 71, Walsh 185, effective, I think that's effective, 236 U.S. 273, and Payo versus Morse 171 New York 423, and Gitlow versus New York 268 U.S. 652 at Stafford J. speaking to the court said that a state in the exercise of its police power may punish those who abuse the freedom by utterance inessential to the public welfare, tending to corrupt public morals, incite to crime, or disturb the public peace is not open to question. Robertson versus Baldwin 165 U.S. 281 41 L.ed. 717 Supreme Court Rep 326 Patterson versus Colorado. You know what? I'm going to leave that. That's a whole bunch of legal jargon. Thus it was held by this court in the Fox case that the state may punish publications advocating and encouraging the breach in criminal laws, and in the case of Gilbert case, that the state may punish utterances teaching or advocating that its citizens should not assist the United States in prosecuting or carrying on the war with its public enemies. At present, legislative investigations are being conducted into such un-American racial and religious propaganda imported from foreign lands. The propriety of prohibiting such propaganda was vigorously expressed in the National Democratic Platform of 1916, on which Woodrow Wilson was elected during the Great War, but before our entry into it, in the following plank. There is gathered here in America the best of the blood, the industry, and the geniuses of the whole world, the elements of a great race and a magnificent society to be welded into a mighty, splendid nation. Whoever are actuated by the purpose to promote the interest of foreign power in disregard to our own country's welfare, or to injure the government in its foreign relations, or cripple or destroy its industries at home, and whoever by arousing prejudice of racial, religious, or other natural nature creates discord and strife amongst our people, so as to obstruct the wholesome process of unification, is faithless to trust which the privileges of citizenship repose in him, and is disloyal to his country. We therefore condemn as subversive to the nation's unity and integrity and destructive of its welfare the activities and designs of every group or organization, political or otherwise, that it has to its objects of advancement of interest of foreign power, whether such object is promoted by intimidating the government, a political party, or representatives of the people, which is calculated and tends to divide our people into antagonistic groups, and thus to destroy the complete agreement and solidarity of the people, and that the unity of segment and purpose so essential to the perpetuity of the nation and its free institutions. This present bill may properly be approved in principle in the present juncture. It goes too far, however, and is artificially drawn. It not merely condemns dissemination of propaganda against race, creed, and color, but against any person who belongs to a particular race, creed, color, without reference even to the relationship to such race, creed, or color. It furthermore includes propaganda causing and tending to cause any person belongs to any peculiar race, creed, or color to be shunned or avoided. Moreover, comprehensive terms cannot be conceived it practically prohibits all propaganda, caricatures, and statements, printed or oral, or referring to any individual as everyone belongs to some race or color, and most of our citizenry to some creed. The terms propaganda, characters, statement are even sought to be enlarged by adding the phrase et cetera, which certainly cannot be sustained in a penal statute. The bill ought to be limited to print and manifolded propaganda and statements and public oral statements as drafted despite a laudable purpose. The bill can be approved only in principle. The report was adopted by the full committee on March 1st, and the president of the association, Mr. Charles A. Boston, in approving the report wrote, "I doubt the constitutionality of the bill as drawn. In the view of the comprehensive report, it may be approved in principle if confined within constitutional limits." So that was all of that. Okay, so I'm going to take this in a little bit of a reverse order. I'm going to start with the legislation at the very end from Max J. Kholer. It was very influential, as we'll discuss here in just a minute. But I want to start with his opening. He pointed out that it's next to impossible to do anything about, systematic racism of any sort, and it's actually very detrimental to this country. And I agree with that. From personal experience, I know it's almost impossible to do anything about, especially in the heat of the moment. But that also kind of is why we should be fighting even harder for our rights, to preserve our freedoms, and our right to be different. Case in example, Sarah Goodman at Jenny Craig, I have a song about it, would come up to me and she would tell me that she was Jewish, but then she would say this awfully just super anti-Semitic, clearly ignorant of what the Holocaust stuff to me was. She actually came up to me and told me that she wanted to get a pension from the German government. Well, one of Hitler's points, his platform planks, was to create the pension. There was no German pension before then. So if you're telling me that your grandparents were entitled to a pension, that means that they were government workers for the Nazi party, And then she would tell me stupid stuff like this. Oh, well, Jews have blood diseases. It's known. It's nothing personal. It's not accusatory or demeaning. It's science. It's not science. That is demeaning. That is accusatory. That's so terribly anti-Semitic that almost a century ago, the Jewish community here got together and had this discussion, determined that that was the definition of Nazism, and decided that we needed to do something to stop people from doing stuff like that, from saying stuff like what Sarah Goodman said. Now, if you go through PubMed, right, and you search for Christian genetic diseases, what you're going to get is no quoted text. You're not going to find that. If you do that for Jewish genetic diseases or Ashkenazi, heck, if you do that for atheists, you're going to come away with certain genetic diseases. Why? Because people like to target things that are a minority for whatever reason and try to quantify and define it. And they'll try to say, they're going to use science to do this. But you can't really do that scientifically, as this whole discussion was talking about. So what ends up happening with this law is basically, first off, it does get changed a little bit. If you look all the way to the left there, I have a letter from the Office of Civil Rights, where they discuss it. And it specifically says in that last paragraph there, although Title VI does not prohibit discrimination based on religion or discrimination against Jews, Muslims, Sikhs, and members of other religious groups, it does prohibit discrimination based on a group's actual or perceived ancestry or ethnic characteristic, rather than its members' religious practices, right? So I think that does need to be expanded to generally cover those religious practices as well. But when we're talking about genetics, we're specifically talking about somebody's ancestry or ethnic characteristic. And when we're talking about it here, we're talking about somebody's perception of an ethnic or religious characteristic. within this discussion that we read here, we had Jews, and then we even had a Christian perception of what a Jewish person's eugenic factors would be, right? Ellis Hollingsworth gave that interpretation, and we'll get to a whole bunch of reasons why that was, not right either here in just a minute. But he actually endorses, the bottleneck hypothesis that gets tossed around so very, very much, right? So we see that is going on today. There are tons of studies that are being used in education which discriminate based off of one person's perception of somebody's ancestry, and then correlates that to a religion, which is the Office of Civil Rights was saying that's illegal in 2010, right? And there's a whole bunch of other letters up there that say this from the civil rights. But then we go to my two cases here, right? And now, granted, the one in California that's kind of cut off there, I went full gambit, right? So part of it was, that they've forced these eugenic stereotypes into education. I even put in there that, they're talking about Nazism and stuff. But also there's other parts of Christianity that are forced into schools, right? The calendar is one. If you watch my video where I read through my Supreme Court brief, which got kicked back, and part of the reason why I'm doing my study is so that way I can reassert that case. But I probably won't make the point of the calendar, right? Because it is apparently a really big issue for people. But is that the calendar is Christian. You can call it Common Era or whatever, but it's still the year zero or year one of it starts with the belief that Jesus Christ lived and died on a cross as a Messiah, right? Louis C.K. makes a great bit about it that was hard to find because I think he offended some people when he said it, so, they had to pull it. But anyway, his point was, that we won and that the Jews are the only people that keep their own calendar, right? And that's true. We do have our own calendar, but that is an element of Christianity in school. For me, my big part before even the genetic part was musicology, music history. Typically, music is taught as if Gregory, this monk, Gregorian chant, started music history as we know it. But it actually goes back way, way further than that. The Byzantine system, which really was Gregorian chant, was the more common and the system of music notation that we actually developed music out of. So Gregorian chant really has a very limited impact on the historical development of Western music as we know it. Very limited. It's Christ washed, we can call it, or whatever you want to say, but that's musicology for you, right? And so what the Office of Civil Rights comes back with is saying, hey, Title VI doesn't protect you because it doesn't protect religious minorities. So shove off. And then I moved to New York and I reassert the case and I say, hey, no, I'm appealing this decision, but I'm going to appeal it with your agency instead, right? And I'm saying, hey, look, these are genetic stereotypes. So that is a perception of somebody's ancestry, right? That is your perception of what my ancestry, what my genetics must be to be considered Jewish according to science. And that is being taught in schools. And New York comes back and says the same thing, saying, hey, the Office of Civil Rights has no ability to actually enforce or to judge this case because Title VI does not prohibit discrimination based on religion. So basically, you're just getting denied a hearing at any level, even if you're saying, hey, look, this is somebody's perception of my religion, right? And in doing that, they've actually segregated out the community by saying, hey, look, these people have the genetic characteristics of Jews. They have the genetic markers of a Jew. And so by a scientific test, it doesn't matter if they practice or not. I can tell if they're Jewish by taking a DNA sample. Whereas within the Jewish community, as the discussion we just read, as the law of return for the state of Israel, the opposite is true. The Jewish community would say, hey, Your genetics do not matter. We should not be counting ourselves because we don't believe that the Messiah has come, and that's for them to do. And, there's adoptions and conversions and yada, yada, yada. So the opposite's true, right? If there is no genetic connection, it's a religion. And so in order to be acceptable for birthright, right, by the law of return, according to the letter of the law, it states that anyone who is converted to Judaism and has not converted to another religion since, anyone who is born to a Jew or married to a Jew who is converted to Judaism or was, again, born Jewish and has not converted to another religion, then they are considered Jewish. So you still have to be a practicing member of the Jewish community to be considered Jewish. And that actually came out in an Israeli Supreme Court decision with this guy, Oswald Rafuston, who was a Catholic priest who tried to assert that he was Jewish by DNA. Now, he was in the Holocaust, this Oswald guy. He survived it, but he also converted during the Holocaust to Catholicism, right? And then he tried to assert that as his connection to being Jewish later on, citing a genetic connection, which leads us back into... Why isn't it? Jump around a little bit here, and I'm going to go through Ellsworth bit. One thing to point out that's really important is that he was a Christian. I believe he was a Unitarian. And so his perception of Judaism is going to vastly be different from a Jewish person's perception of Judaism. And that brings us back to the prior little thing where I was talking about the civil rights, perceiving one's religion. But that inherently, when it comes to a scientific discussion, as Frans Boas pointed out, creates a bias, right? So Ellsworth was interjecting his bias of what he believed Jews were in Who's Who, right? Just like Maurice Fishberg does. Just like these days, people like Harry Oster or anybody who has made any genetic association to being Jewish has done. You've interjected your own bias because you believe that you're Jewish, right? And that makes sense. That's fine. I get it. But that's still bias. And so inherently, it's not scientific. It's inherently just your opinion, not a matter of scientific fact. And that's why Jews wait for the Messiah. That's why we pray for the Messiah, because with the coming of the Messiah, they're supposed to be the ones that tell us who is and who isn't and who's getting their inheritances. And one thing that Ellsworth fails to recognize because of his Christian perception of Judaism, his interpretation of Judaism lens through the Christian Bible, is that the tribes do change, right? When Jesus comes along in his Bible, they have the revelation, and Jesus lays out which tribes are going to get saved. There's 1,200 from each tribe, and they're all the same exact ones that Moses had. But if you look at the tribal inheritances between Jacob or Israel and then through Moses, I have them up there, right? Just a little clip just to show that there is a change there. Simeon and Levi are a pair. Their weapons are the tools of lawlessness, right? But if we go over to where Moses is at, he says, and of Levi has said, let your Thummim and Urim and be with your faithful one to whom you tested at Massah and challenged at the waters of Meribah and stuff. Simeon's not mentioned anywhere, so Simeon's left out, right? And instead, we pick up a different tribe. So the tribal associations do end up changing. And in fact, it's also mentioned by Ellsworth, the Levites and everybody, they end up getting absorbed into Judah. Well, in Christianity, they don't recognize the absorption necessarily, so they still split off Levites into their own tribe, because that's the only way that the revelation from Jesus will make sense, is if the tribes remain the same, right? If there's any change whatsoever or any absorption, then the revelation no longer can exist, because you'd have to once again segregate out Levi from Judah. Well, Judah ends up absorbing all the tribes. That's where the term Jewish comes from, because it ends up becoming just the one religion, which is Judaism, right? Anyway, so we see these tribes get absorbed and stuff. And the Christian lens sees it differently. They would see it as racially, that even though Judah absorbed the tribe of Levi, there's going to have to be some genetic distinction or purity amongst the Levites for them to be, to be congruous with the revelation. But within Judaism, we don't necessarily need that because we don't know who our Messiah is. They haven't come. So we don't know any more than to say, hey, I'm Jewish. There you go. My tribe was absorbed into Judah. It became Judaism. This is my religion and what I believe. That's as far as I'm going to take it at this point because I'm not the Messiah. Some other things he discusses, right, was that the Jews themselves ended up, the more religious Jews, I should say, ended up like segregating themselves and casting out. He brings up specifically the book of Ezra. And this is a common misinterpretation I find that also happens from groups that perceive Judaism through a Christian lens, is that they believe that they compound Ezra and Nehemiah together for whatever reason, and then like just they stop reading Nehemiah at a certain point, I guess, or whatever. But if you read through that, the specific point of what Ezra did by exiling all the Jews who married pagans and stuff gets brought up there, and Ezra gets called out as a slaver, and then the governor Nehemiah ends up stepping in and says, "Wait a second." If they still believe in Judaism, if they're willing to conform to our values rather than the paganism of the wives they took upon themselves, then yeah, bring them back. Otherwise, we've made some of our sons and daughters who are numerous, we've made them get our grain, we've made them plow our fields, we've made them pay our taxes. Now we are as good as our brothers and our children as good as theirs, yet we are subjecting our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been subjected, and we are powerless while our fields and vineyards belong to others. That's specifically talking about that. So the society did fracture between, or after Levite, the super religious ones, if you take Ezra or take Ellsworth's Christian perspective to Judaism, they did fracture. But then immediately after it, in comes the governor of Israel and says, wait a second. Okay, I can understand where you're coming from. So if they don't believe in Judaism, right, then okay, they're exiled. They're no longer part of this community. They can be here as sojourners, right? But those, even if they had a pagan wife, if that pagan wife converted to Judaism and became Jewish and raised the children as Jewish, then they're considered Jewish. And what we did to them was enslave them, right? And that's the point of that book. That's the entire point of that final book, was to make that point. And that's why in the law of return for the state of Israel, it also includes Jewish through the grandparent, because it's a grandmother that went to the governor Nehemiah and says, hey, you enslaved my grandchildren, right? Because my son married some pagan, but he still raised his kids to be Jewish. Then they're Jewish, right? And so that's where that's coming from. Now, the other thing that Ellsworth also ignores, because again, the Christian interpretation of Judaism is heavily reliant on these genetic associations, is that there are people within the Torah who converted or were adopted, right? I didn't include a slide up there, but there's the entire book of Ruth is about the actual conversion process. So she's somebody that was a pagan and converted to Judaism and married. Technically, according to Ellsworth's opinion on Judaism, she and her kids would have been all exiled because she converted, and that doesn't jive for them because of the book of Ezra. But again, because of the book of Nehemiah, which comes after that, it's corrected to say, hey, look, that was a mess up. We enslaved those people. They believe in Judaism. They're still Jewish, right? But we also have, and the one that I like to bring up more, because it's actually brought up here, is the adoption of Esther. Nowhere in the book of Esther does it actually tell you who Esther's parents are. The only line we get in there is this right here, where Mordecai says, the uncle of Mordecai who adopted her as his own daughter, goes to the king. So he became her uncle because he adopted her as if he was his own, right? We don't know if Mordecai's actually related to her mother or father. That is never brought up, not even once. And if you look at every other relationship that is of any importance to the Torah, that's usually brought up, right? Moses' family through the Levites is traced back. We have Rebecca, right? She corrects her lineage to show that she wasn't genetically related to Abraham. We've got all these other characters. They cite their ancestry on purpose. In the book of Esther, they omit ancestry on purpose because she was adopted. And as soon as she was adopted, she became Jewish in all aspects, right? So there's no genetic assertion there. So whenever you're doing these experiments and looking for these genetic markers, you've now exiled Esther as a Gentile. You've now exiled Ruth as a Gentile. You've completely ignored Nehemiah, so you've exiled the majority of the Jewish community as Gentiles. You ignored the commandments regarding incest that forbid it, to define who is and who isn't Jewish by whoever was sinning, whoever was practicing non-Jewish marriages and living basically a Christian lifestyle or a non-Jewish lifestyle when it comes to marriages. And then you ignore the tribes and the Messiah. You just ignore the religion completely to interject your own bias as if it's scientific fact. All right, so now we're getting to Frans Boas, and his remarks, you notice, were like the shortest out of everybody. He didn't really need to say a lot. He had already won this argument, and he was gloating, essentially. So Maurice Fishberg, he ends up apologizing. He gives his blast against racial purity, and that debunks his own theories. Because Maurice Fishberg was doing pretty much the same thing the Nazis were, but to the inverse. So instead of creating negative stereotypes about Jews, he was trying to create positive ones, or the exact opposite stereotypes from what the Nazis had, and trying to use that to break down Nazism, right? But in his own dialogue that we saw in his part of the discussion, he says, there's just way too much genetic diversity. And even these days, we found out that there's even more than what he assumed, which were the three racial types of Europe. There's a plethora, as indicated here by Maurice Fishberg, or not Maurice Fishberg, but by Frans Boas. The genetic diversity is so finite that we're talking about individual families. When you come right down to it, you cannot homogenize a genetic marker to an entire demographic. It will never make sense. You have people that don't belong to that demographic that have those genetic markers. You have people that are members of of that demographic that don't have those genetic markers, right? Esther, who was adopted, wouldn't have the same genetic markers, right? People who converted, right, won't have the same genetic markers. So inherently, by making it about genes rather than religious practice, and ignoring religious practice completely, as modern eugenicists have done by asserting a genetic affiliation to Judaism or attribute to Judaism, they've completely and unabashedly ignored Judaism in its entirety. They've inherently created Jew and Gentile within the community to say, hey, even without your religion, I can test your blood, test your genetics, and tell you if you have Jewish ancestry. Meanwhile, somebody who may not have Jewish ancestry but was adopted or converted, they've been doing this their entire lives. Now, they're no longer going to... You've created a hierarchy that disenfranchises them from the same entitlements, right? Somebody who has never practiced Judaism, doesn't even believe in it or anything like that, can now be scientifically Jewish. But somebody that actually does and has participated, if they were to take the same test, would be told that they're not, right? And then that inherently gets picked up by somebody else, right? It could be not Maurice Fishberg. It could be not Harry Oster. But I'll tell you what's going to happen to Harry Oster's book, Genetic Legacy, Legacy, A Genetic History of the Jewish People. Some neo-Nazi on Twitter is going to pick it up, read it, and then they're going to use that against Jewish people to say, hey, there is a Jew, there is a Gentile, there is race, and so on and so forth, right? So that's a point that Frans Boas here is making, is that there are blue-eyed horses, rabbits, and pigs, just like there's blonde ones and brown ones. None of that determines that the horse is of a different breed, right? You can have horses with blue eyes. They're still purebred. There's genetic degradation and drift. So you may lose or pick up different mutations as time goes on. It's just way too finite. And then on top of that, again, we have Ellsworth, who lenses this entire thing through the Christian perspective and comes up with the bottleneck hypothesis that we see getting reiterated today. The Jewish people were so persecuted and that there was such religious zeal amongst the community that it ends up becoming endogamic. But in order for that to make sense, you have to assume that the Jewish people didn't follow their own religion, right? When it comes to attributing these Jewish genetic markers, they assumed endogamy was the cause of it. Well, endogamy is forbidden within the Jewish religion. So what that tells me is that you're essentially taking people whose family habitually never married according to Jewish custom and saying that they're Jewish. That would be like telling me that pepperoni from pork pizza, is a kosher dish. It categorically would not be kosher if we consider the Jewish religion within the parameters of the experiment. But like Ellsworth did, the current modern eugenicists like Harry Oster and the rest didn't. They did not consider the Jewish religion at all within their experimentation. And so that's why they counted themselves and enrolled in these genetic studies as if the Messiah had come, because they were full of such racial pride that they actually believed in racism, and then used that as a means to define themselves as Jewish through that racial pride, right? And this is, again, something that Frans Boas and Max J. Kholer brought up, that, it doesn't matter if the stereotype's good or bad. It's still racism and it's still racial pride. This is a religion, and we have certain beliefs. You have to consider that in your experiment, right? Because if you don't consider that in your experiment, then you're going to misidentify the people that you're testing and insert your own bias. And that was the contribution that Frans Boas actually makes to sciences. He says anthropology can be an element of science. You just have to define the religion as part of your experiment. You have to define the parameters of it. So for this example, we would say, in the parameters of this experiment, those that we would be cataloging as Jewish would be practicing members of the Jewish faith and members of a Jewish congregation. But then you'd also have to explain how you collected your samples and counted them without collecting or counting samples, because it's inherently forbidden within the Jewish religion to count yourselves directly. So how would you do that? And none of that is explained in any of these works, which is why one of the reasons why all this was discredited when the Nazis were held on trial, and why we saw the eugenics movement really wane. It got really kicked back for a while, right? But there were always adherents to it. As Max J. Kholer brings up, these ideologies, the genetic associations made to being Jewish, it doesn't matter if they're good or bad. That is actually what the KKK was doing in America, right? And so if you're going to say, oh, well, I'm not a Nazi because, my grandparents survived or whatever, but I still ardently believe in the racial dogmas of the Nazi party, well, then, all right, fine. You're a member of you're a KKK guy. That's what you believe in. You have the same opinions about Jews as the KKK. Oh, is that offensive? Okay, well then we'll say eugenist. It doesn't matter. I can go through every point in history, point out every single anti-Semitic organization, faction, movement, whatever the heck, every single racist POS that's out there will have the same exact opinion that Sarah Goodman had, when she told me, there was a conversation regarding Jews to have certain blood diseases between her and me. It was never, you have a disease. It was more of a scientific discussion. It was not accusatory or demeaning. Excuse me. Yes, it was. Yes, it was. If we go back to the Spanish Inquisition, they were saying the same thing. And as Max J. Kholer pointed out, it becomes very hard to tackle this, right? Because every single time this racial propaganda and its racism and its propaganda comes up, we have to then show that it links to actual hate, to actual discrimination. And for whatever reason, if you throw this into the scientist's face, what I found out is they will say, well, this is historical or an empirical proof. It's not scientific proof, right? And so, like, thank God for Oxford, because Oxford understood it, and they were like, look, we don't do, when it came to my study, they were like, we don't do empirical studies. What you're doing is good. You're on the right path. It's very interesting. But that's the link I've got to make in my study. So I have people helping me with that. That's what my editor's trying to help me make that link by saying, hey, look, we've analyzed the data. This is empirically proven. Every time that you make a genetic association with there being Judaism, there's an increase to anti-Semitic hate crime within wherever the community is. There's an increase to general racism and general hate crime. Every single time this is done throughout history, going back 800 some odd years, right? And then we look at modern studies and correlated it that way. And then we actually looked at the reports of hate crime and correlated it that way. So we have to go above and beyond for us to stand, for the Jewish community to stand on, hey, this is the Torah, to stand ourselves, to build our house on the Torah. We have to go through such extra lengths than some racist POS that believes that the KKK were onto something and that the Nazis weren't racist, like Sarah Goodman, then, that's okay. I don't actually have to prove that those people were practicing Jews or actually believed in Judaism, or were from Jewish religion or from Jewish families. I just have to insert my own opinion here, and that's good enough because I have a degree. And we're repeating history here, because this video where I'm reading this book I'm having the same conversation in the same city as what was had 90 years ago. Just think about that for a moment. And we're in the same, loop of time where we have immigration being discussed in the same way, where we're having people that have migrated here who are legal citizens being exported or deported to or exiled to another country and stuff, and wherever you want to sit on the immigration issue, whatever. The point is, these are a lot of the same things, a lot of the same statements, a lot of the same ideologies, a lot of the same propaganda, a lot of everything. We've seen it all before, and everything is being repeated here. And that's actually the point that my study is making, right? So hopefully Andrew gets out of the hospital soon. We can get it finished up. This has probably been the hardest thing I've ever had to do in my life. Like, I've gone to these museums, I've read these rare books that nobody else has read. Stuff like this, even the curators, the Holocaust Museum, didn't know was down in their rare books room until they pulled it up. People that are experts of Jewish history and genetics didn't even know this book existed, completely ignored it, and then made Maurice Fishberg look like he was a scientific genius, when even Maurice Fishberg was like, wait a second, I screwed up here, and then pulled away from the public spotlight. Would endorse the statements of Ellsworth, who also did much the same thing. He pulled away from the scientific spotlight, other than hosting a journal that started in, I think 6 years after this, which is a low-rung journal that doesn't see a lot of publication. So we still have Cold Spring Harbor Laboratories, the same lab that Frans Boas here was fighting back in his day, is still open and still getting public funding and stuff. And we still have government and healthcare employees like myself going, well, America, we're not Nazis in this country. Our government does not support this. This is something that's coming out of the private community, and it's stupid. We still have public employees that are saying that, right? So that's where we're coming from. Anyway, I hope that you've enjoyed this reading. Um, I may end up doing the Patai myth of the myth of race reading as well. I'll probably do that next week or something. There's a good section in there where they discuss what Frans Boas did here to say, hey, everybody's family histories are different. So correlating genetic markers to a demographic is foolish. It is a knife-like stab into soup because everybody's trading genetics. They're even just moving from one place to another will change your genetics. The life experiences you have will change your genetics, right? Like the Rwandans, right? They have certain families have stress-induced genetic markers, right? Maybe not. That's probably not the best way to put it, because there's an experiment done where they tried to change genetics using stress-induced, but this is a little bit different. It's basically after the Rwandan genocide, they found that there were certain genes within the generation following in certain families that were induced due to psychological parameters, right? So basically, you were in such a state of fear for so long that your genes kind of changed, right? But that's not uniform. And even within that same generation who inherited those genetic markers, we'll say, even though inherited's probably also the wrong word, even within that generation, some of them lost it, right? So not only are we not testing horizontally, testing a wide enough population to make sure that we're not cherry picking and inserting our own bias, we're also not testing that same wide population over several different decades. So like even one person's going to have their genetics change throughout the course of their life. You can't just take the one sample size of like 500 people and then say that's how it is. You would have to do 5 million people, and then you'd have to do 5 million people every couple years throughout the course of their entire lives, and then do that with their kids, and then do that with their kids and kids and kids. And thus far, there's not been an experiment which actually does that. There have been experiments which do horizontal testing, which disprove a lot of the rhetoric to say, hey, Jews have specific diseases or black people have specific diseases. There have been experiments that do that. There have been experiments that do across one family, across time, and across generations, but they've never really combined both of them. And even where there is, like your sample sizes just aren't big enough to really collect or correlate the data. And then you're just making it all about statistics, as Ellsworth pointed out, which was his point of saying, hey, I was wrong here because I was taking a statistical approach, which you can't do with something like a religious community because their religion defines them, right? You know, so all that just kind of gets ignored, and we're having the same discussion. So that's why I read this. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll probably read the other one next week, and there'll be another music video next week. Yeah. Fight the good fight.